The letter arrived on a Tuesday, though Josephine did not see it until Wednesday morning, when her aunt's footman left it propped against the inkwell on the writing desk in the small room at the back of Alderton Hall that had served as her private corner for 3 years. She recognized Lady Alderton's seal on the outer fold before she read a single word, and she set it down again and looked at the frost on the window glass for a long moment before picking it up a second time. The letter was addressed not to her, but to Sir Neville Price of Stoke Grange, Derbyshire. It had been placed on her desk in error, or perhaps not in error at all, and when she unfolded it, the first line told her everything she needed to know about the next several months of her life. Her aunt wrote that the matter of the Hartwell debt, £800 carried forward from Josephine's late father's affairs, would be settled by the arrangement discussed, and that Miss Hartwell would arrive at Alderton Hall by the end of the month, prepared to receive Sir Neville's formal addresses. She refolded the letter exactly as she had found it and placed it back against the inkwell. Her hand was steady. It had been steady through worse mornings, but the window glass held her gaze a little longer before she went to dress. That same evening, in the parlour that smelled of damp wool and the candle her aunt kept burning low to discourage late reading, Lady Alderton informed her that she would be travelling to Derbyshire at the end of the week, and that a hired coach had been arranged from the village at Whitmore Cross. The journey was approximately 40 miles, which would see her to the coaching inn at Broxfield by late afternoon, where the carriage from Alderton Hall would collect her and carry her the remaining distance. Her aunt spoke with the brisk, measured tone of a woman organising a delivery. She asked Josephine if she had any questions. Josephine said she had none. She packed her travelling case that night. It was a small case, brown leather worn pale at the corners, and it held one change of dress, a volume of verse she had borrowed from the library downstairs, and a grey wool travelling cloak she had owned since before her father died. The cloak was large and slightly too warm for late October, but she packed it anyway. She had learned to take the things she valued when she travelled, because she had learned not to count on them being where she left them when she returned. The morning she left, the footman carried her case to the yard and gave her the ticket for the hired coach without meeting her eyes. He said the coach would leave at 7. She thanked him by name, which was Thomas, and he looked briefly surprised, as he always did when she used it. The hired coach was a battered vehicle of indeterminate brown, drawn by 2 horses in reasonable condition, and driven by a man called Pegg, who wore a hat he had owned for at least 20 years. There were 2 other passengers at Whitmore Cross, a widow in black wool who spoke to no one, and a merchant's clerk with a ledger case who spent the first 6 miles reading and the next 4 asleep. Josephine sat with her back to the horses, her small case at her feet, and watched Hertfordshire move past the window in its late autumn dress, the fields stripped and pale, the hedgerows thinning to black wire. She had the volume of verse open on her lap, though she was not precisely reading it. She was thinking about the letter, and about the £800 her father had left behind him when he died, and about what it meant to be arranged as a settlement. It meant something specific and material inside the world she inhabited in 1823. It meant she was being placed, as a piece of furniture is placed, in a room someone else has chosen, to serve a purpose someone else has named. She turned a page without reading it. The first change house was at a village called Harndon, 12 miles out, where the driver stopped to exchange one of the horses. The widow descended to use the inn's facilities and did not return for 20 minutes. When the coach resumed, there was a new passenger. He came across the inn yard with the unhurried step of a man who was accustomed to waiting for nothing, though nothing in his dress announced that. He wore a coat of dark wool that had seen a winter's worth of travel, a plain cravat, and boots that were clean but not polished to the standard the coat's cut seemed to want. He carried a single bag, medium-sized, and handed it to Peg with a quiet word of direction. He was perhaps 35, with an angular face, and the kind of dark eyes that seemed to be doing something more than simply seeing. He took the seat opposite Josephine without flourish, settled his coat, and looked out the window at the road behind them with the same focused stillness a man uses when he is thinking something through. His name, he told the clerk when that gentleman woke and asked, was Wyndham. Edmund Wyndham, travelling on private business. Josephine noted the name with the mild attention she gave to all ordinary information. She returned to her verse. The rain began near the 14th mile. It came in sideways off the flat fields and drummed on the coach roof in irregular bursts, and the widow pressed a handkerchief to her mouth, as if the noise itself were an affront. The clerk tucked his ledger case more firmly under his arm. Edmund Wyndham looked at the road as the light shifted and the world outside the windows went grey and wet and quiet, in the specific way that English rain makes the countryside go quiet. Josephine's volume slid from her lap when the coach jolted through a rut. It hit the floor at Edmund's feet, splayed open at a page she had been reading more than once that week, a passage about the particular weight of things decided without asking. He picked it up before she could, glanced at the open page with an expression she could not quite read, and passed it across to her. "You were near the middle," he said. "I was, thank you." He did not look away immediately. "It is an older edition," he said. The printer's mark on the spine. "My father had the same." She looked at him more directly then. "Do you read it?" "Less than I should," he said. "More than I once did." There was a beat of quiet between them that was not uncomfortable. The rain intensified for a moment, then relented. She turned back to the page and he returned to the window, and the coach moved on through the grey morning with the particular intimacy that close quarters in poor weather produces between strangers. Not friendship, but a temporary suspension of the distances that society otherwise maintains. The clerk descended at the next village, which freed one seat and reduced the close interior to 3 occupants. The widow dozed. Edmund Wyndham read nothing and carried nothing to read, which Josephine found slightly peculiar. Men who travelled without occupation for their hands were either very rich, very bored, or very troubled. His coat said the second. His eyes, she thought, said something else. She caught herself thinking it and returned to her verse with some firmness. The Midway Coaching Inn appeared at the 21st mile, a long, low building called the Hayward Arms, set back from the road behind a cobbled yard where 3 other coaches stood in various states of rest. Peg announced a 30-minute stop for the horses and passengers alike. The widow revived immediately and descended with purpose. Edmund Wyndham stepped out and stood in the yard, turning his coat collar up against the wet air, and looked at the inn's frontage with an expression of mild assessment. Josephine descended more slowly. She had learned to be slow at coaching inns because rushing produced collisions with strangers, and strangers produced complications. She smoothed her cloak, tucked the verse volume under her arm, and went inside to find the inn's small parlour where travellers might wait. The parlour was warm and smelled of coal smoke and wet wool, and the kind of mutton stew that has been kept on the fire longer than strictly necessary. She found a seat near the window and ordered tea from a girl of about 16 who looked as though the morning had already been very long. While she waited, she allowed herself to look at the yard through the glass. The yard was busy in the particular way of Midway inns. A second coach had just arrived from the north and was discharging passengers with luggage. A boy of perhaps 4 or 5 years old stood near the gate in a coat too thin for the October air, holding the hand of a woman who appeared to be inquiring after something at the coach door, her attention pulled away from the child who was shivering in small, controlled spasms that children produce when they are cold and have decided not to say so. Josephine watched him for a moment. She set her tea down untouched, lifted her grey wool cloak from the back of the chair where she had draped it, and went out into the yard. She did not think about it in a way that felt like a decision. She crossed the cobbles, crouched slightly so she was nearer the boy's height, and settled the cloak around his shoulders. It swamped him entirely. He looked up at her with the solemn, wide-eyed assessment that small children use on strangers who do something unexpected. "It is a great deal too large," she said, "but it will do until your mother is finished." He said in a very small voice, "Thank you, miss." She nodded at him as though they had concluded a reasonable piece of business, and returned inside. She did not look back. She did not notice or did not register that Edmund Wyndham had come to stand at the edge of the yard's overhang and had watched the whole of it with the still, focused attention he had directed at the road all morning, now directed at her. She found her tea and discovered it had gone slightly cold. She drank it anyway. She was considering whether to order a second cup when she heard her aunt's voice. Not her aunt herself, she realized a moment later. The voice came from the room adjacent, where a thin wall and an unlatched interior door had apparently been left open enough to carry sound with perfect clarity into the parlour. The maid was reading aloud. Josephine recognized the voice of the maid, a young woman called Agnes, who had travelled with Lady Alderton from Alderton Hall, and who read correspondence in a flat, conscientious tone as if each word were a stone she was turning over. Agnes was reading the letter from Sir Neville Price. Not the letter Josephine had found on her desk, but a new one, a reply, written in the self-satisfied prose of a man who has already decided an arrangement is complete and is now simply filling in the particulars. He wrote that he was gratified to have Lady Alderton's confirmation. He wrote that the £800 would be discharged from the estate account at Stoke Grange upon the signing of the settlement document, which he understood would take place within the fortnight. He wrote that he did not anticipate any difficulty with Miss Hartwell, as she had been described to him as a sensible young woman of moderate expectations, and that he expected moderate expectations would serve them both well, as he required principally a household manager and not a companion, and that he trusted Lady Alderton understood the distinction. He trusted Lady Alderton understood the distinction. Josephine sat very still with the empty teacup in front of her, and the coal fire warming the left side of her face, and the voice of Agnes carrying each stone of each word over the unlatched door with conscientious clarity. A household manager, not a companion. She did not move for a long moment. The fire snapped once. She heard Agnes turn the page. She set the teacup down very gently in its saucer and looked at the yard through the window. The boy with her cloak was still standing near the gate, and the cloak was still enormous around him, and his mother had turned back to him now, and was looking at the cloak with the particular expression of a woman who does not know what has happened, but can see that something has. She felt the cold spread from somewhere near her sternum outward. Not grief, precisely. Something more like the recognition of a shape she had suspected, but had not been willing to look at directly. £800. A household manager. Moderate expectations. Her aunt had not arranged a marriage. She had arranged a placement. She was still sitting in this posture of cold clarity when Edmund Wyndham came back inside from the yard and found the only available seat in the small parlour to be the one across from hers. He sat down. He looked at her once, briefly, with those dark eyes that did something more than simply see. "The tea here is poor," he said. "It is cold," she agreed. "I have ordered something else." He paused. "Are you well, Miss Hartwell?" She looked at him. He had used her name. She had not given it to him. She almost said so, and then remembered that Thomas the footman had spoken it aloud at Whitmore Cross, when he gave Peg her ticket, and that Edmund Wyndham had been in the yard at that hour and would have heard it. "I am quite well," she said. "Thank you, Mr. Wyndham." He did not press. A pot of coffee arrived, which he divided without ceremony, and they sat together in the warm parlour while the rain continued outside and the fire snapped in its grate, and Agnes's voice fell quiet through the adjacent door. Josephine wrapped both hands around the coffee cup and felt the warmth move into her palms, and thought about 40 miles, and about how much of a life was determined by what a person was prepared to tolerate in silence. She was not, she decided, prepared to tolerate it indefinitely. She had not yet decided what she would do about it, but the deciding had begun, quietly in the region behind her sternum where the cold had settled. They returned to the coach when Peg called the 30 minutes done. The widow had elected to remain at the Hayward Arms, which left the coach's interior to the two of them and to whatever the next 19 miles would produce. The boy with the cloak was gone from the yard. Her cloak went with him, she supposed. She found she did not mind. The rain had softened to a fine, steady drizzle that blurred the windows and made the road ahead look like something half-remembered. Edmund sat as before, angled toward the window, his hands quiet on his knees. She sat as before, though without the verse now, which she had tucked into her case. Without the book between her hands, she felt slightly exposed, as if she had put down a small shield she had been carrying so long she had stopped noticing its weight. He spoke first, after perhaps 4 miles had passed in the peculiar, intimate quiet of a coach in rain. "The volume you were reading," he said. "There was a passage, the page it fell open to." She waited. "I did not read it deliberately," he said, "but I saw enough about the weight of things decided without asking." "It is a precise observation," she said. "It is," he agreed. He looked at the road. "You are travelling to a decision that was made without you." It was not a question. She looked at him for a moment, and he met her gaze with the same level patience he had offered all morning, and she understood that he had heard nothing through any unlatched door. He had simply been watching with the attention he brought to everything, and he had seen the shape of the morning in her face when she came in from the yard. "My aunt has arranged a betrothal," she said. It was the first time she had said it plainly, without the softening of maybe, or I believe, or I am not certain. "For reasons of debt. My father's debt, which became hers to manage, and mine to resolve." He said nothing for a moment. Outside, a stretch of bare oak trees moved past the window, their branches stripped and black against the grey sky. "And the man," he said. "Sir Neville Price," she said, "of Stoke Grange. He wants a household manager. He has said so in writing." Another pause. The wheels found a stretch of better road and the ride steadied. "What do you want?" he asked. The question was so plainly put, without sentiment or performance, that it landed before she had time to deflect it. She looked at her hands, which were folded in her lap over the worn leather of her case, and she thought about what she wanted with the honesty she permitted herself only in rooms where no one important was watching. "I want to be asked," she said finally. "Not about this particular arrangement, about anything. I want someone to ask before deciding." He looked at her. She did not look up for a moment, and then she did, and there was something in his expression that she could not name, because it was the expression of a man reading something carefully that he has been looking for a long time. "That is a reasonable want," he said. "It is the only one I have left that feels affordable," she said. They sat with that for a mile or two. The drizzle deepened briefly and then relented again. Josephine thought about the cold feeling behind her sternum and noticed it had moved slightly. Not gone. Moved, which was different and less heavy. She became aware in the slow way that awareness builds in close quarters, of how very near he was. Not improper near, simply near in the contained geometry of a coach, built for 4, carrying 2, where the space between facing seats is enough for knees to be careful of each other, and where hands resting on opposite knees are separated by less than the width of a library desk. She was aware of the steadiness of his presence in a way she had not been fully aware of the merchant's clerk's presence or the widow's, which meant his presence was different in some way she was not prepared to examine directly. She examined the window instead, he said quietly, without looking at her. When you gave that child your cloak. She turned back. You did not look around to see who was watching, he said. You simply did it. He was cold, she said. He was, Edmund said. And there were a dozen people in that yard who noticed and did nothing. I had the cloak, she said. That is all. He looked at her then with an expression that was not quite a smile. The expression of a man who has heard an answer that confirms something he already knew, and whose satisfaction with it is too private to display fully. She did not know what to make of him. She only knew that the 40 miles were almost done, and that the doing of them in his company had made something in her chest less tight than it had been when the morning began. The coaching inn at Broxfield came into view at the 38th mile, set at the top of a slight rise, where the road widened into a proper forecourt. It was a larger establishment than the Hayward Arms, with a painted sign of a stag and a long frontage of local stone that had weathered to the colour of old honey. Lamps were being lit inside as the coach came up the rise, the afternoon having gone dark early under the low cloud. Peg pulled the horses up with practised ease and called down that they had arrived. Josephine gathered her case. Edmund descended first and offered his hand at the step, which she took for the single second it required and released. She looked at the inn's frontage while he spoke a quiet word to Peg about the bag. The carriage from Alderton Hall was not yet in the yard, which meant a wait of some minutes, perhaps longer. She was thinking about how to manage the wait with composure when the inn's front door opened and a woman came out. She was perhaps 50, solid and capable-looking, with the bearing of someone who had run a large establishment for 20 years and had the keys to prove it. She wore a grey dress and a white apron, and carried herself with the brisk authority of a good housekeeper who recognizes a situation at a glance. She looked at Peg's coach, looked at Josephine, and then looked at Edmund. Her expression changed entirely. It was a very specific change. It was not the change of recognition in the ordinary sense. It was the change of a person who has been trained for a very long time to respond to a single face with a very particular degree of deference, and who, encountering that face unexpectedly in a coaching inn-yard, cannot entirely prevent her body from responding before her mind has decided whether to. She came down the 2 steps to the forecourt and said, "My lord, we did not expect you at Broxfield. I had understood you were expected at the hall directly, not by way of public conveyance. Are you well? Shall I send to the hall to say you are arrived?" The yard was not large. There were perhaps 8 or 10 people in it. 2 ostlers, a pair of travellers waiting near the far wall, Peg on his box, and a boy with a lantern who had come out from the stables at the sound of the coach. Every one of them heard it. Josephine stood with her small case in her hand, and her father's debt arranged behind her eyes, and the long day's accumulated weight of 40 miles pressing down on the back of her neck, and she heard the word, "My lord," land in the cold October air, and stay there, perfectly audible, perfectly irrevocable. She looked at Edmund. He was looking at her. Not at the housekeeper, at her, with the same quiet, focused attention he had offered all day, now carrying something else beneath it. Not apology exactly, something more like acknowledgement, the expression of a man who has chosen the moment of a thing and is now inside it, and is more concerned with what it means to the person watching than with what it means to himself. Mrs. Croft, he said in a voice that confirmed everything, because it was the voice of a man who has been addressed correctly and knows it. Thank you. I will speak to the hall myself. He paused one beat. A carriage is expected here for Miss Hartwell. Would you see that she is made comfortable until it arrives? Mrs. Croft looked at Josephine with the swift, thorough appraisal of a woman recalibrating very quickly. Of course, my lord, she said. Miss Hartwell, please come inside. We have a private parlour with a good fire. Josephine did not move for a moment. She was looking at Edmund, who had not moved either, who was standing in the lamplight of the Broxfield forecourt in his travelled coat, with its wrong polish on the boots, and who was, she now understood, Edmund Wyndham, Earl of Cresmer, which was not a small title in Derbyshire or anywhere else in England in 1823. Mr. Wyndham, she said, and heard the slight edge in her own voice, which was not anger precisely, but the particular tone of a person who has been told a partial truth all day and is recalibrating. I beg your pardon, he said quietly. The title tends to rearrange rooms before I am ready for them to be rearranged. I travel without it where I can. She held his gaze for 3 full seconds. He did not look away. The coat is wrong for the boots, she said. A pause. So I have been told. Who told you? You are the first to say it aloud, he said. Another pause, this one quieter. The ostlers had resumed their work. Peg was already backing the coach toward the stables. Only Mrs. Croft remained close, and she had the professional tact to be looking at something else. Josephine looked at her small case. She looked at the inn's lighted windows. She thought about Lady Alderton, who was somewhere inside this establishment or expected presently, and about Sir Neville Price's letter with its careful language about household managers and moderate expectations, and about the shape of the next several months of her life, as she had understood it this morning. She picked up her case and went inside. The private parlour was warm as promised, with a good coal fire and 2 chairs angled toward it, and a table with a lamp burning on it that threw soft light across the floor. Mrs. Croft brought tea without being asked and said the carriage from Alderton Hall was expected within the hour. She said it with the slightly elevated courtesy she had already calibrated for Josephine's new context, and Josephine sat with the tea and the fire and understood that the world had already shifted on its axis in the Broxfield forecourt, and that Mrs. Croft's instincts had moved faster than anyone's deliberate intention. Edmund came into the parlour 10 minutes later. He had done something to his cravat. Not much, but enough to indicate that he had been standing somewhere briefly, and had addressed the question of the coat's expectations. He sat down in the second chair without asking permission, which Josephine found she did not object to. "How long have you known?" she said. Not a question exactly. "That you were Miss Hartwell?" He settled his hands. "From the ticket. I heard your name at Whitmore Cross." "I mean the arrangement. How much did you hear?" "Nothing through any door," he said. "I told you the truth in the coach. The morning was legible in your face when you came in from the yard." She looked at the fire. "And the rest. You knew who I was being sent to." "I know Sir Neville Price," he said. The 4 words carried a precise and concentrated distaste, delivered without heat, the way a man who has known someone for a long time and found them consistently wanting delivers a verdict that has had years to settle into certainty. "He has an estate in Derbyshire. We are not acquainted by choice." She turned to look at him. "And my aunt, you know Lady Alderton?" "Slightly," he said. "She is known in Derbyshire society. She is a woman who manages her circumstances with considerable calculation." "She is," Josephine agreed. "She has managed mine for 3 years." The fire shifted. A log settled with a sound like a slow exhale. £800, Josephine said. "That is the figure. My father's debt, carried to my account at his death and managed there ever since. £800 to be discharged from Sir Neville Price's estate account upon the signing of a settlement document. She said it the way she had not permitted herself to say it all day, plainly, the numbers exact, the terms clear. That is what I cost. Edmund was quiet for a moment. You do not cost £800, he said. Your aunt owes £800. Those are different things. She looked at him. He met her gaze with the same patient directness he had maintained all day, and she understood that he was not offering her comfort. He was offering her a correction which was more useful, and which she could take into the room ahead of her and use. The door of the parlour opened. Lady Alderton came in. She had arrived in her own carriage, apparently, and had come to the Broxfield Inn ahead of it to collect Josephine, or perhaps to ensure that Josephine was collected before anything else could happen to the arrangement. She was a tall woman in her late 50s with the kind of face that had been handsome 20 years ago, and had settled into authority instead of softness, and she wore a travelling dress of dark green that she had clearly put on for the occasion of managing things efficiently. She took in the private parlour at a glance, the fire, Josephine in one chair, the man in the second chair, and the expression on both their faces, which was the expression of a conversation that had been allowed to run to its natural conclusion. Her gaze moved to Edmund. Something crossed her face. Not recognition exactly. The beginning of recognition, impeded by the coat and the boots and the absence of the retinue, she would expect to accompany the rank she was beginning to suspect. "Josephine," she said, in the tone she used when cataloguing a situation, "I did not know you had made acquaintance on the road." "Mr. Wyndham was kind enough to share the coach at Harndon," Josephine said. Lady Alderton looked at Edmund again. "Mr. Wyndham," she repeated. Mrs. Croft had followed her ladyship into the parlour because a good housekeeper follows guests into rooms where she may be needed, and she was now standing just inside the door with the expression of a woman who has inadvertently started a fire and is watching it with professional attention. Edmund rose from the chair. He rose with the particular unhurried ease of a man who has never needed to rise quickly to command a room, because the room has always been his, without requiring it. He said nothing. He simply stood, and the standing was enough. Lady Alderton's expression completed its journey. She had run through the Derbyshire nobility in her mind. Josephine could see the inventory being conducted behind her aunt's careful eyes. A Wyndham in Derbyshire, Edmund Wyndham, the Earl of Crestmer, the master of Crestmer Park, which was the largest private estate between Bakewell and the northern moors, encompassing something in excess of 3,000 acres of good land, and a great house that had been in the Wyndham family since the reign of the second George. The colour in Lady Alderton's face changed in a way that had nothing to do with the fire. Mrs. Croft said in the quiet voice of a woman who has decided that clarity serves everyone present, "My lord, shall I have a message sent ahead to Crestmer Park? They will want to know you are safely arrived." "My lord," spoken again in the presence of Lady Alderton, who was now standing in the warm parlour of the Broxfield Coaching Inn, with the full weight of what she had arranged falling across her like cold water. "Thank you, Mrs. Croft," Edmund said. "In a moment." He looked at Lady Alderton with the mild, courteous expression of a man who has nothing to prove and knows it. "Lady Alderton," he said, "I understand there is a matter of £800 and a settlement document concerning your niece. I wonder if you might be prevailed upon to reconsider the terms." The room was very quiet. Lady Alderton opened her mouth, closed it. The colour continued its adjustment. "The debt," Edmund said in the same level tone, "will be discharged. The settlement document will not be signed. If you require any further assurance on either point, you may apply to my solicitor at Lincoln's Inn, whose details I will have sent to Alderton Hall by the end of the week." He looked then at Josephine. She was standing by the fire with her small case at her feet and the long day's full weight somewhere in the set of her shoulders. And she was looking at him with the expression of a person who has been asked nothing all day, and is now, for the first time in a considerable while, being considered. "Miss Hartwell," he said. He paused, and in the pause was the full weight of 40 miles, and a dropped volume, and a child in the yard, and a question about what she wanted, and her answer, which had been to be asked. "I should like very much to call upon you at Alderton Hall, if you would permit it, in the ordinary way, with your knowledge of who I am, and nothing decided in advance." A fire settled. Someone outside in the yard called something to an ostler. She looked at him for a moment. "Yes," she said, "I would permit it." Lady Alderton made a sound that was not quite a word. Sir Neville Price was not in the room, and would not be told for several days that the arrangement had collapsed, and when he was told he would send a letter to Lady Alderton that used the language of inconvenience, which was the language of a man who has never learned the difference between an inconvenience and an injustice, and which was answered eventually, briefly, and not by Josephine. Mrs. Croft showed Lady Alderton to the inn's best sitting-room, with the practised grace of a woman managing a situation, and the door of the private parlour was, for a few minutes, quietly closed. Josephine sat back down in the chair by the fire. Edmund sat in the second chair. The lamp on the table made a small warm circle that reached both of them. "You might have told me," she said. "I might have," he agreed. "I have found that the title tends to end conversations before they have said what they mean." She considered that. "And ours said what you wanted it to say." "What I needed it to," he said. "Yes." She looked at the fire. She thought about the morning and the letter on the desk, and the word "my lord" landing in the forecourt air like a stone dropped in still water, and the ripples that were still moving outward through the room. She thought about how she had given a child her cloak in the yard of the Hayward Arms, without looking around to see who was watching, and about how someone had been watching anyway, with exactly the quality of attention that made the watching matter. The fire was good and the lamp was warm, and the road outside the window was the same road it had been all day, 40 miles of it behind her, and a different kind of distance ahead, one that had not been there this morning when she packed her small brown case. She was still in the chair when the carriage from Alderton Hall arrived to collect her. She collected her case and her composure and went out to the forecourt, and Edmund walked out with her, and Mrs. Croft held the door. The night air was cold and clear, the rain entirely done, and the yard was lit by a pair of lanterns hung from iron hooks on either side of the door. Josephine stopped at the top of the inn's 2 stone steps, not because she needed to, because the moment asked for it, and she had learned over many years of a constrained world to notice when a moment was worth pausing inside. She turned to look back through the open door at the private parlour with its good fire, and its 2 chairs angled toward each other, and the lamp still burning on the table. From where she stood, the room looked exactly like a room in which something had been decided honestly, without pressure or arrangement, between 2 people who had been plain with each other for 40 miles. She supposed that was what it was. Edmund was standing at her shoulder, close enough that she was aware of the solidity of him in the cold evening air. He said nothing. He did not need to. The forecourt and the lanterns and the night with its cleared sky and the road stretching away into the dark were all speaking clearly enough. She descended the 2 steps and crossed the forecourt to the carriage from Alderton Hall, and the coachman handed her in with the particular deference of a man who had driven a great many people and knew which ones warranted it. She settled her case at her feet and looked out the carriage window as the vehicle turned in the yard. Edmund was standing at the top of the inn steps, with the lamplight falling across the coat that was still wrong for the boots, watching the carriage go with the same still attention he had turned on everything all day, and which she now understood had been, all day, turned principally on her. She did not wave. She was not the sort of person who waved at coaching inn steps in the late October dark. But she did hold his gaze for the 3 seconds the turn allowed her, and in those 3 seconds there was the full weight of 40 miles, acknowledged between them, plainly, without performance or arrangement, in the particular way that a thing is acknowledged when both people know it and neither one has been asked to pretend otherwise. The carriage rolled out of the forecourt and onto the Derbyshire road. The lanterns of the Broxfield Inn receded behind her, and the dark came up around the carriage in the warm, pressing way of late autumn evenings, when the sky has cleared and the stars are beginning to show at the edges of things. Her small brown case sat at her feet. The verse volume was inside it, folded under the change of dress. She thought she would read it properly this evening, now that she was on the other side of whatever the day had been. She thought she might read the passage about the weight of things decided without asking, and find it meant something different than it had this morning. Alderton Hall's lights appeared at the end of the drive 30 minutes later, warm and ordinary against the dark. She had lived there 3 years and known it for what it was the entire time, a place that denominated her worth in pounds and arranged her accordingly. She stepped out of the carriage and stood in the gravel drive and looked at the lights. The gravel was the same. The door was the same. The cold air smelled of the same Derbyshire earth it had always smelled of, turned and cold and faintly sweet with the last of the October grass. She picked up her case. She went inside. Behind her, in the forecourt of the Broxfield Coaching Inn 20 miles back up the road, a lamp was burning on the table in the private parlour, where 2 chairs still faced the fire, and the night air outside was cold and clear, and there was nothing in the room that needed explaining to anyone,